Scientists studying animal behavior have observed these creatures in many instances engage in some pretty sophisticated and impressive behavior that seems to be reminiscent of the type of behavior we display as human beings. For example, researchers have observed chimpanzees both in captivity and in the wild mourning dead. And it's clear that they seem to have an emotional response to the loss of members in their group, that they seem to, again, recognize very real loss. Many evolutionary biologists interpret this behavior as reflecting kind of an evolutionary antecedent that is a preamble to the evolutionary emergence of our sophisticated behavior as human beings. The question is that interpretation valid? I'm joined today by Dr. Kyle Keltz, who's going to help us address that question and more. Kyle has a PhD in the philosophy of religion. He's a Christian scholar. He's a professor of English and philosophy at the college level. Kyle, thanks so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Fuzz. I'm excited to talk about this because I don't know how many people are talking about this methodology with animal cognition. So.
Yeah. Well, not that many, at least in Christian apologetic circles. First of all, as Christians, how should we interpret these kind of studies?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're going to talk about some methodological distinctions. I think, just as a Christian going into it, we don't need to be all that worried about it. I know something that you emphasize a lot is that one researcher will say something like the claims you're mentioning, that it seems like animals aren't different in kind from humans. So we share something with some animal. But what we need to emphasize, for one, is, of course, Christians need to be using discernment. But for every, in animal cognition, it's almost like for every researcher who says that we're the same, there's also others who are saying, no, we don't think that this conclusion is warranted.
Yeah. So
we don't need to be all defensive going into it. And there's a few distinctions that we can keep in mind that'll help guide us along.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've talked about before, and this is something that you, I think, bring up very importantly in your PhD dissertation, is that as human beings, we have a tendency to anthropomorphize. And
yes.
and there's concern that may actually influence the way we interpret these results. So first of all, what is anthropomorphism, and maybe a little bit about what is the source of our tendency to anthropomorphize as human beings?
Okay, yeah. So anthropomorphization is whenever you attribute human abilities or human attributes to animals. In the context of animal cognition, I mean, you can anthropomorphize anything. Like I'll say that my printer doesn't like me, or that's an angry storm. But anytime you're attributing human abilities or attributes to something, you're anthropomorphizing. Now, a couple things I wanted to talk about, because especially in the study of animal cognition, there's some history behind kind of almost like this bias towards anthropomorphization, but I also wanted to talk about why it's just natural for us to do it.
Yeah.
But the history behind it in the study of animal cognition is that after Darwin's theory really took hold, a part of his early theories, one of them is that he thought that there was this phylogenetic scale, right? And so the idea was that human beings are the same. All animals are the same in kind. It's just that human beings are at the top of this phylogenetic scale, and they're, in degree, they're just the best at the top, and at the bottom, they thought it would be this smooth transition all the way to the bottom, almost like a stepwise smooth thing that you would find in nature. So because a lot of researchers were buying into this, they were starting to really look for human attributes in animals. So they were in the literature, you can see them around this time, saying that, well, rats can reason, or dogs can make inferences of various sorts. Well, a researcher who came on the scene was Lloyd Morgan. And he started to emphasize, he said, look, I think you're you're basically you're overeager with this phylogenetic scale. And he came out what we now know as Morgan's canon, which is an anti-anthropomorphic principle that when you're studying animals, you should never attribute higher order processes, human-like abilities to animals whenever you could explain it with a lower order process. It's almost like a Occam's razor of animal cognition. And anti-anthropomorphization is a principle that's actually still taught in animal cognition textbooks today, and it's emphasized in the study of it. But something that we've talked about before when we address the problem of animal suffering, and we talk about what it's like, maybe what is it like to be an animal, is that we know that one thing that we think makes humans unique is that we have this almost intrinsically personal ability, this intrinsically personal awareness when we view the world.
Yeah.
And because that's what I tell people, I say, animals aren't self-aware, so they don't suffer as persons. And you hear some people say, well, that just sounds absurd. It doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, the problem is that whenever you think about what it is like to be an animal, you're using this autonoetic awareness, this intrinsically personal awareness, and you're casting it upon that question. So, but if you think about it, that's what we basically do to everything. The way we view the world is from this first personal perspective, this self-aware perspective. So I think as human beings, because that's what we are, we just naturally attribute human-like attributes to things. And especially with animals, because they're so similar to us, because, humans are rational animals, and then you've got non-human animals. But when they do activities similar to what we do, it's so easy for us to just think that they're reasoning through it like we do.
Well, kind of to build off of your point, the way I think about this, and I think it's essentially saying the same thing that you're saying, but maybe with different language, is that as humans we have theory of mind, right?
Yes.
That I recognize that you have a mind just like mine, and I can begin to anticipate in what you're thinking, what you're feeling, right? And then we have this desire to kind of link our minds together, right? And that's part of what makes us unique. Animals don't seem to have that capability, but the net effect is that we then start attributing a human-like qualities to everything else around us.
Yes.
Inanimate things and in animals, and that's the danger, right?
Right.
So even if you're operating with this anthropomorphic mindset, it's very difficult to break away from that because of our tendency as human beings to do that very thing.
Right.
Yeah. So what might be some other ways that people could maybe interpret the sophisticated behavior of animals then, if it isn't due to the type of reflexive planning that we show as human beings?
Okay. Yeah, and that's like one of the major theories in animal cognition, animal learning, is something called associative learning, right? So, I like to talk about what associative learning, and it's so much more complex than this, obviously. I worry about sometimes people, I try to explain to them really quickly, like an elevator pitch for what it's like, how animals learn and how you explain their behavior. And a lot of people seem to reject it because it sounds too simplistic. So don't be taking everything I say to be comprehensive, how animals learn, but a lot of their behavior is innate. So they do seem to act on instinct. You and I were discussing just the other day, chimpanzees or great apes in general, they seem to have, we saw a study that said they seem to have 70 to 80 gestures that they use to communicate in a way. But they thought that those were innate, almost instinctual, because the interesting thing was that it wasn't just gorillas that had the gestures. The chimpanzees and the bonobos, they all had the same gesture, so it looked like it was innate. So instinct is a big part of it, but we know that animals do learn too, though. But it's what's called associative learning, right? And associative learning is when an animal it comes into some event or sees something, and it associates that thing with either a reward or a punishment, right? So one study I like to talk about that kind of helps us get an idea for what kind of inferences we can make as to whether animals are thinking like we do or not is a study they did where they were just studying whether dogs could make exclusionary inferences. So in this study, they would show a dog that they had several cups, and they would show the dog that the ball, they had a ball, and they would show it that it was underneath one of the cups. And if the dog would choose the cup with the ball in it, it would get a reward. But what they would do is they would sometimes they wouldn't show them where the cups were. They do all sorts of controls, but a lot of times they would show the dog that they would lift one cup and then lift another to show it that the ball wasn't underneath there, and they're just trying to see if the dog would choose the cup with the ball in it, more than chance probability times. So now, and what they found was that the dogs were choosing the ball with choosing the cup with the ball in it more than chance times. So, but there's two ways to interpret this, right? If we want to go more of an anthropomorphic route, we can think that the dog is making an exclusionary inference, right? The ball is not underneath this cup. The ball is not underneath this cup. Therefore, the ball is under this cup, right? But if you're going to use a simpler explanation using associative learning, some researchers thought, well, we can maybe explain it. We don't think that they're actually making a logical inference like that. It's more of a process, like a proto-logic process, where it wouldn't be not in here, therefore in here. It's just they just associate empty cups with the reward being in the other one. Do you know what I'm saying? It's right. An associative process, not a logical process. Right. And it's also important to remember as well, because we do this all day. We think in sounds, right? We think in language. Animals don't have language. So when they think, they're thinking in pictures, maybe right. sounds and things like that. Right. Can you imagine like writing an article and you're trying to lay out some logical argument, and all you can do is just show pictures next to each other? Like it would be hard it'd be hard to get your idea across to somebody else, but that's what they're right. doing. They're associating right. this one thing with another, and we don't think that you necessarily have to attribute right. exclusionary inferences to these dogs to explain what their behavior was. Right. It can be explained associatively.
Yeah, and what I find interesting is, through associative learning, animals can actually presumably develop pretty sophisticated behaviors that give the appearance of, again, rational capacities or the ability for planning and problem solving. And there was an interesting study done by a researcher named, I think, Johan Lund, who pointed out that AI systems, which are based on machine learning, which is associative learning, can actually, through associative learning, be able to beat a chess master playing chess, right?
Right.
And so it's the point being is that very sophisticated behaviors can emerge through associative learning. And he actually developed a mathematical model that he applied to animal behavioral studies, showing that some of the sophisticated problem solving that you see in chimps or in corvids could actually be accounted for through associative learning, that the models actually produce that kind of behavior. And so when we think about AI systems, that's how they're learning, is through associative learning.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting when you told me about that, because it not only kind of provides evidence that Morgan's canon is a good idea, because you can use these use AI to show that they can do amazing things with associative learning. So I thought that it was really interesting how that could apply to animal cognition. I was also thinking that this could apply, or maybe help us, maybe the other way around, and take what we've learned from animal cognition studies, the differences between human and animal learning, and maybe apply this to AI and say, well, maybe this gives us an idea of the boundaries of AI. Right. If all AI can do is associative learning, and it can't think symbolically like humans, then maybe it won't ever have the language or the
Right.
other capabilities. So as you know, maybe as Christians, whenever you see a really sophisticated robot, you can know that it's doing all that through associative learning, not something like the
Right.
human type learning that you need a soul for.
But here's where I think the danger of anthropomorphism becomes, again, concerning, because we're going to have a tendency to, again, attribute human-like qualities to AI systems.
Yes, and yeah, when you talk about the dangers of anthropomorphization, I think it's especially, we're talking mainly for Christians, I think, right? Because and when you think about the non-Christians approaching cognitive studies, I think it's a really great tribute to the scientific method that they do have this, because thinking that all life comes from a universal common ancestor really, I think, would maybe have some people want to lean to more of anthropomorphic interpretations of the evidence. But also, it's in science and cognitive studies, we just mentioned they have this check in place to try to say, is it really like a human, or are we anthropomorphizing when we shouldn't? So I think that's amazing. But I think they still are going to have this tendency to want to attribute human-like properties to, we've been talking about, to either animals or maybe hominids or stuff like that. I thought maybe a Christian researcher might want to attribute human-like properties or abilities to hominids, maybe in the search to have faith and science cohere. But what I think, and I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't even be mentioned. We just focus on animals, but it's especially animals. And I hate to say this. I hope animal lovers out there don't get upset. But the thing is, we have to really be careful as Christians to realize if you do think that animals have a mind like a human does, in philosophy especially, the philosophy of mind, the mind is thought to be an aspect of the soul. To have this immaterial principle about you that gives you the capability to have an intellect and a will. There's a lot of theological baggage with that, right? So having a mind or a soul is what's thought to give humans the ability to have free will, and it makes us moral beings. And if you're a moral being and you have God telling you something to do and you don't do it, that gives you the capability to sin. The soul is what's thought to make it possible for us to survive the death of our bodies. The soul is thought to be what gives us self-awareness. So here, there's a couple issues with that. If you think that animals have a mind like human beings do, then that means they have a soul, and now they can sin. There's going to be self-aware, and I just think there's so many issues with that. A huge issue, I think, is to notice that God did tell us that we could eat animals. He allows us to eat animals. He even commands for the Israelites to sacrifice animals and eat them in the Mosaic law. So if we think that animals have minds like humans do, then now we're talking about God almost like commanding cannibalism or something like that. So now we've mentioned before that the Bible does seem to say that animals are soulish, but it says that only human beings are made in the image of God.
Right.
But I would just like to let everybody know, it's like you said, what do we say when some researcher thinks that animals are like humans in these various ways? We just need to remember that because of the anti-anthropomorphic principle and them thinking that a lot of researchers think that most animal activity is attributable to associative learning. So even though one researcher might say it looks like that we're just like animals in this one way, a lot of researchers say that we're not. Yeah. So we don't really have anything to fear from science in this area. And I think the evidence is going to continue to show that we are very extremely different from animals in that symbolic capabilities and self-awareness and all that.
Thank you, Kyle. If you want to know more about the work of Kyle Keltz, please go to our website, www.reasons.org, and search Kyle's name, and you can find resources that Kyle has produced on behalf of Reasons to Believe. And you can also find ways that you can go to Kyle's website and access the books and other resources that Kyle has produced as part of his own personal ministry. So thank you so much.